years down the Nile. It was like something out of a movie. And then when we were in Aswan, Egypt, she had a heart attack. And that was my first introduction to journalism. I was on the ground inside Gaza during the 51-day war between Israel and Hamas then. And sometimes I would go into Gaza just to have breakfast with a Hamas official. We're often there for the worst day of someone's life. And on October 7th, it just happened to also coincide with the worst day of my life.
How do you wake up on that morning?
So,
thank you so much for doing this. Oh man, I mean, you are so busy. I was just watching you inside on Fox like an hour ago as I ran downstairs. I just finished the book about 30 minutes ago. Amazing. And if it's okay with you, we'll just hop right into it. I know your time is so precious. I have 1,000 notes that we're probably not going to get to. But man, Black Saturday, published by Fox News Books. Man, everyone needs to add this to their library. It is, I didn't expect it to be so emotional. You know, I jumped into it and was like, okay, I'm going to get a better feel for what was happening there because you've been on the ground since day one. And man, I was emotional like right off the bat. Like you got me right off the bat. So not only do you talk about what's happening there, add context, humanize it, facts, of course, but it's an emotional read. Did you know it was going to be so emotional when you started it? I mean, you must have.
yeah, definitely. It's a book about humans and the people involved in this conflict. And I tried to take an approach to this book the same way that I take an approach to journalism, and that's humans first and talking with everyone involved. And it's my first book, and so there were some surprises. I think you go into a process like this, and sometimes it turns out totally different than what you imagined it would look like. But I think with Black Saturday, I was able to capture what the experience was like for people on the ground on October 7th, but then also those critical first weeks of the war as the conflict unfolded.
Yeah, you really do. And I'm always so impressed with, and I have a lot of questions about this because I've always had questions for war correspondents. And so you're going to get the brunt of them as we talk here, just how you remain so calm. And actually, I'm going to get to that in a little bit because you do provide an answer in the book with some advice that a correspondent gave you years ago. But before we get to that, your path here, your grandmother took you to Egypt when you were 16. She made a promise to you that she would do that, and you guys go to Egypt together. She's 82, you're 16. She ends up having a heart attack and a stroke. She survives. But I think this might be the first time you got me as I was reading, and this is early in the book, and you kept a journal during that time. Can you talk to me a little bit about that trip, how that came about, and then what you did with those notes when your grandmother did pass away?
All right, this is Jack Carr checking in, and I'm so fired up to introduce you to the Sig Sauer P226 40th Anniversary Edition pistol. As you can tell, the 226 is my favorite pistol. It was on my side for every single deployment downrange, and even when I had to put my long gun aside to go into a meeting or go somewhere where I couldn't take my body armor and my long gun, that 226 was on my side. Right here, retro packaging. Let's check this thing out. 226 40th Anniversary Edition. Look at this. And this is exactly the same way that it was delivered back in the 80s. Retro styling here on the packaging. Absolutely love this pistol. Thank you guys, everybody at Sig Sauer, for everything that you've done for me, the United States military, and 40th Anniversary Edition pistol. Awesome.
BCM AT Angular Torque Optic Mount. Twice the clamping force at the rail. Unprecedented zero retention. Less points of failure. The BCM Raider modular rail for AR rifles is built using a double wall extrusion, creating one of the most rigid free-floating platforms in its weight class. BCM Raider offers Picatinny rails and features either M-LOK or Keymod interfaces at 3, 6, and 9 o'clock for the placement of additional enabling accessories. Go to BravoCompanyUSA.com and get yours today. Thank you to Bravo Company Manufacturing for your support of military law enforcement and the Danger Close podcast.
Yeah, definitely. I shared this story in the book because it's a story I think that is really the reason I got into journalism. I was 16 years old, and my grandmother, from when I was a little kid, promised me one day she'd take me to Egypt. And I've got a twin sister, and she and I every day after school would go to my grandmother's house, and we did these workbooks. And the workbooks were basically to introduce kids to different parts of the world. And I loved this one about ancient Egypt. I wanted to be Indiana Jones when I grew up. And she said, look, when you're 16, keep working hard in school. I'll take you to Egypt. And we went. And it was an incredible trip. I saw the pyramids of Giza. We took a cruise down the Nile. It was like something out of a movie. And then when we were in Aswan, Egypt, she had a heart attack and a stroke. And as a 16-year-old, I'm not an operator like I am now. It was overwhelming. I didn't really know what to do. And so the way I handled that as a teenager was to start taking notes about the experience. And I had started to journal about our trip before. And that was my first introduction to journalism, to writing about far off lands to tell people back home about them. And so when she passed away a few years ago, I buried all of those notes from Egypt with her, with the exception of one page. And I took that page back to Egypt and floated it on the Nile. And my grandmother is still a huge influence in my life. What she taught me as a kid, I still use today in the real world. Because again, everything that we do, it's about people. It's about interaction with other humans. And she taught me how to be a good person, how to ask people about themselves and get people talking about the thing that they care about most, their own life.
Yeah. And I think that hits me so hard because of my relationship with my grandmother who passed away, over a decade now. But she was such an influential person in my life and so strong and had seen so much from the Great Depression through World War II and everything after that. So anytime someone has a strong relationship with their grandmother, it always gets me. And at that point, did you already know you wanted to go into international journalism? And when did you find out what a war correspondent was? And was that through news or through film or books, television? How did you find out about the profession that you're in right now?
Yeah, we traveled a lot growing up. And so I had seen a lot of different parts of the world. I always had a curiosity about other people and places. And then I went to school at American University in DC, and it's an international school. There were students from all over the world there. And I went into school as a major in international relations because I figured I could start studying the world and then figure out what I wanted to do next. And I joined the school TV station. And I remember one of my friends in the school TV station, a guy named Ford Fisher. And the two of us would sit and we'd pitch these ideas to the school TV station about what we wanted to cover in DC. And it's a city that you've got everything going on there, whether you want to cover politics or foreign policy or even domestic policy. But the school TV station didn't let us go into the field like we wanted to. There were protests going on down the street, and they would say, go cover the latest fork shortage in the cafeteria, or how about the fact that the library is running a special on these books, you can rent them for 2 extra weeks. And we didn't want to cover that stuff. We wanted to get out there and get into it. And so we made a decision. We're going to start our own news company, and we called it News to Share, the number 2 in the middle. I bought a bunch of different domain names, and that was one of them. I'm a sophomore in college trying to figure out what I want to be. And I started to figure out maybe journalism could be that way to travel the world and meet different people. And so we built News to Share. And News to Share started out with an idea of being basically a service where we would get video from other people around the world and then incorporate that video into our reports so that we could bring people closer to the stories. Ultimately, it turned into a large stringer service where I would go to far off lands in college and sometimes domestic protests and riots, shoot raw video, interview people, try to get the real story on the ground by spending a bunch of time there. And then we bring it to our audience. And our audience initially was like 10 people on YouTube. And then it grew and it grew, and we started to sell video to other outlets. And I traveled the world for News to Share. I was 20 years old. I was on the ground inside Gaza during the 51-day war between Israel and Hamas then. I went to Ukraine after the revolution. I was on the ground in sub-Saharan Africa. We covered the domestic unrest in Baltimore and Ferguson. And that was the real taste of journalism that we were looking for in college. And we finally started to get it. And that's, I think, when I got the itch. I knew this is it. This is my career. I'm going to be a war correspondent. No one's going to stop me. And I'm going to continue to do old school journalism like Cronkite, like Murrow, the guys who came before me who did it right, who talked to people and got in the field and brought the stories back from these far off lands.
Yeah, you really get the sense from the book, and I wish I had a physical copy. It hasn't arrived yet, so I read it on PDF. You really get the sense that you are in that tradition of the great war correspondents of the past. You don't say that in the book, but you just, as a consumer of news, having watched all these things growing up, aware of these different people, also seeing it in films and TV, and always being in tune with that because I'm interested in what's going on in the world back then, because I thought that it would help me as a leader and an operator in the SEAL teams, and just it was my responsibility as a citizen regardless. But you get the sense that you are in that tradition, and as I'm reading now that I write fiction and have TV shows and things like that, I'm like, wow, this would make a great movie, real. And then obviously people would think you'd have to tell them it was real because it is like a thriller. It's like it reads like fiction. What you've done with your life. It's incredible. So what was your path to Fox after that then? How did you get into Fox News?
So right after school, I looked around, tried to find a place that would hire me on air. And I started at a real small outlet covering the White House. And so I covered the first 16 months of the Trump administration, and I worked for a conservative outlet. And so people thought that my questions were going to be conservative or that they were going to be right-leaning. And I was able to carve out my part of political coverage in DC, which is a pretty competitive beat just by the fact that everyone is covering the same story. And I just did it, again, the old-fashioned way, talking to people, telling people the truth, and demanding answers from public officials, Republicans and Democrats, because that's always been my approach. And so covering Trump was interesting because the entire world was watching, especially the early days of the administration, but also there was an intrigue to what was happening both on the domestic front and on the foreign policy front. And I just worked, I hustled, and I kept the end goal in mind. And I think that's the critical piece of information that I always tell people when I talk about the path to get here to being the chief foreign correspondent for Fox, is that you've got to know what the goal is. And I always knew what the goal was. And so it was just figuring out, okay, what's the step today? What's the step this week, this month? And so covered politics for less than 2 years. And I'd met this guy who is an agent from New York when I was in university, when I was doing all these stories for News to Share. And we met for dinner in Georgetown. And he gave me his card and he said, when you're ready to go to the big leagues, give me a call. And one day I left the White House, had a tense conversation with my boss at the time about something internally. I said, I'm gonna call this guy and see what he has to say. And he said, let's start talking to people. And so I met with everyone, every single network, every single media outlet. And Fox ultimately said to me, hey, would you move to Jerusalem? And I said, yeah, I want to be a war correspondent. Absolutely, I'd move to the Middle East. They said, when can you move? I said, when do you need me there? And that started what has now been a 6+ year relationship where I basically moved my entire life to the Middle East, used Jerusalem and Tel Aviv as a base for coverage in the region, and then have been basically jumping off from here. And so the past 6 years, I've covered the biggest international stories, whether it's on the ground here with the wars taking place in Gaza. I was in Ukraine the night the Russians invaded and spent almost 200 days there on the front lines, also in the eastern Donbass region and also in the south. Covered conflict all over the world. Was in Iraq after the U.S. drone strike that killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. Was on the ground after the Taliban took over in Afghanistan for weeks. Covered the Gulf. And really have been able to carve out what has always been the dream, to be a war correspondent, the guy on the front lines, bringing the stories back to viewers in the United States. And that's what I continue to do today. And for the short term, that's my plan, to keep doing that and keep covering these international stories as they develop.
Yeah, I've been following along the whole time, and we're recording this a little early because of scheduling, but this podcast is going to come out. The book Black Saturday will be available when people hear this, but actually today is the 3rd anniversary of Abbey Gate, and you were there in Afghanistan right before Abbey Gate, is that right?
Yeah, right before and right after Abbey Gate.
Man. So you have been, so what was your first, once you set up shop essentially in, did you start in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, or did you start in one and then add the other as kind of your 2 bases of operation in the Middle East?
So started in Jerusalem. We've still got a bureau there. And moved my life to Tel Aviv just because it's nice to be able to walk to the beach and have somewhat of a social life when you're constantly working. But I was sort of trial by fire. Like I got here and there were these border demonstrations with Palestinians at the Gaza border, and they were called the Great Return March. And the Great Return March was basically a series of weekly marches that went on for more than a year. And you can hear above me, there's a plane. There's still a lot of civilian traffic that is landing here in Israel, despite the heightened tension. The country is operating in limited capacity, especially with airlines, but it keeps operating. But so when I first flew in, back in 2018, we went straight to the Gaza border, like the next day. And the bureau chief at the time took a stick, and on the ground, he drew a map of Gaza and then put an X where we were in this field next to a kibbutz, a small community along the border. And he said, Gaza City is here. And to me at the time, having only reported in the region one other time, it was surprising to see how close everything was. But we started covering these marches and these demonstrations on the border, but from both sides of the fence. So sometimes I would go into Gaza and I would cover the war and the wars and conflicts that would develop there, but also the weekly border demonstrations. And then sometimes I would report from southern Israel when this took place. And this really threw me into the story right away because I had to talk with the Israeli army, and I also had to talk with Hamas, really from the first days that I got here. And sometimes I would go into Gaza just to have breakfast with a Hamas official, to try to source up there so that I was getting the latest information on these marches, and sometimes small rounds of conflict would develop. Covering that then turned into covering the wars that would erupt between Israel and Hamas, or Israel and Islamic Jihad. And then as the story continued here on the ground in Israel, other stories developed. And so I would fly out and cover those and be on assignment for sometimes a few months and then come back and report. But I think everything combined together really threw me into this cycle of international journalism because it changes really rapidly and you have to be able to shift your focus on stories. And that's really, I would say, part of the challenging part of this job is covering everything at once and keeping your finger on the pulse of world news, right? Because today is a great example, right? We're following these ceasefire developments, the conversations that are taking place in Cairo, Egypt. Also following the tension with Hezbollah in the north and the Israeli airstrikes against Hezbollah today and some of the rocket fire along the northern border. I'm also talking to people in Ukraine. The Russians launched missiles and drones into the country today, sending basically the entirety of Ukraine into bomb shelters. And then we're looking at places like Sudan. We're looking at the situation in the South China Sea. You have to be able to basically step back from the map and check in with all these locations so that we're ready to go. If some major thing develops, I can jump on TV, jump on camera, and start talking about it.
Yeah, I've noticed on TV, especially in the early days after October 7th, and you talk about one particular instance in the book where you're reporting on something, not that you saw and then start the cameras, but as you're seeing it for the first time, you're having to report on it. So there's no prep other than what you've done up in your life until that moment. What is that like, jumping into that? And do you feel, you mentioned it briefly in the book, do you feel like a character when you step on in front of that camera, meaning there's so much happening all over the place? There's dead bodies, and then there's police officers, and there's military, and there's helicopters over, but there's jets over here. There's someone telling you can't film, someone arguing with that person. So much is happening. And then you have to go on and talk live to an audience of millions. What is that like to make that switch? I see actors do it now in Hollywood where they're joking with you 1 second and then bam, they're in character. And I see it on news programs when I'm on and I'm talking to the host and the commercial's just about over and they're joking either with me or with somebody else on their set, and then boom, they're back in it and bam, right on point. So what is that like? And does it feel like when you flip that switch that you're playing a character because you have to come across as informed and calm and cool and collect? What is that like?
Yeah, definitely. And you might be able to relate to this. I always tell people if I didn't pursue a career in journalism, I'd probably serve in the military. I really respect those in uniform and the people that serve our country. And I think a lot of the operators that I meet in the field, because there are a lot of similarities in the places that we go. And so I talk to soldiers all around the world. The best soldiers, I feel like, are able to do in a way what good journalists are able to do amid war, and that's to slow things down, to keep your composure, to breathe through the intense moments. and put things into context. And that's really what the job is about a lot of the time. And I think that's what separates good war correspondents from great war correspondents. It's the ability to stay calm and think while you're talking. And I read about this in Black Saturday. That morning, October 7th, we're the first international team to get to the Gaza border, and we don't really know what's happening at the time. And slowly we're piecing together what's going on, but it's not totally clear. And then suddenly people are dying in front of us. And Hamas is getting closer to where we're reporting from. And I've got to do live reports for TV. I've got to update social media. I've got to keep my facts straight and keep the information in line so that people can get some level of clarity about what's happening. And this takes a level of focus that I actually don't traditionally have in my personal life. I'm not really so focused day to day. It was difficult, I think, to write a book because of that. I'm thinking about 1,000 things at once. I'm really interested in developments that are happening on the ground. And so I'm reading an article here, listening to a book, texting a source, getting a phone call. It's all happening at the same time. But I think that that approach to life has made me a better journalist because you're able to juggle things in a way that you can be both focused and unfocused at the same time. And so in the same way that if you're focusing on a target when you're shooting, you also need to be able to look what's behind and also what's around you. And I find that I do that in the field a lot. I'm focused on one thing, but my mind is also thinking about a lot of other things at the same time. And so it's this in between and being able to shift back and forth, I think that is really the centerpiece of what I'm doing. And then there's also the emotional component because you can't approach this craft from an emotional standpoint. Because if you do, you're going to break down in real time. I mean, we're often there for the worst day of someone's life. Mm-hmm. And on October 7th, it just happened to also coincide with the worst day of my life.
Yeah.
But this is our work. This is the job that we are meant to do. It's what we're trained to do. It's what I have experience in doing, not just here on the ground in the Middle East, but around the world. And so you put that stuff aside, you focus on the mission. And if you ask my team, the background of my phone throughout the war has been stay focused on the mission.
Yeah.
Because you have to just dial in. And that's what we did.
Yep, I saw that. I highlighted it in my notes to ask you about staying focused on the mission. Something I thought about in Iraq and Afghanistan. Something I write for my main characters in my thrillers, and I saw that you have it right there a couple times in the book. And you talk about having ADHD. I would never have guessed that watching you on the news until I read the book, and then hearing you talk now about all the different things that you're juggling at one time. It's a lot. There is that prioritize and execute type of a thing once you've made that decision, but as you're moving into that shot or whatever else it is, you sound like you have a gazillion things going on, not to mention one of which being safety, especially in the early days of this war.
Yeah, definitely. And I find that depending on the environment, it can be challenging to keep all that in mind. And then on top of the fact, especially when you're reporting live, you've got to be right. You can't mess up. I mean, there are millions of people relying on the information that I'm providing. And on a difficult day like Black Saturday, the title of the book, October 7th, that information is really the only lifeline that people have around the world to what's happening on the ground in Israel. And I found that there's a similar responsibility in all conflicts that we cover, but especially those initial days. It's happened in Ukraine as well, where when the Russians invaded, people turned on the news because they were looking for any reliable source of information. And so that can be challenging. I find the most challenging part, and I love that we have the place to talk about it, because we don't really talk about this stuff much. It's a thing that I store in the back of my mind that sometimes I think about when I'm by myself on a run or at the gym. But it's the moments when you have a lot of adrenaline pumping that you really have to be able to dial it in, because you feel your hands want to shake, you feel your breath change. And that feeling can also be addicting in the long run because you want to get back in the mix on these stories. And I found it also not just on the morning of October 7th, but I write about this in the book when we would go into embeds inside Gaza, because we're in the middle of a firefight and we've got to keep reporting. But also, like you talked about, safety is really, truly the number one priority there. And the threats are all around you. And you have to maintain sort of this level-headed nature and constantly remind yourself, okay, I've got two things to do. The first thing I need to do is survive. The second thing I need to do is get the story in that order.
Yeah, wouldn't work the other way. When you're talking about first getting there to Israel and developing sources in Gaza, probably with the Israeli military, other facets of society in both those areas, it sounds a lot like an intelligence service. There are a lot of parallels, it seems to me, between being a journalist, particularly a war correspondent, and someone in the intelligence service. Obviously, the end goals are very different, but the way you cultivate resources, assets, sources, so you can either paint a picture or understand context, report, or on the intelligence side of the house, get information or turn someone, or whatever you need to do. But it sounds like there are a lot of similarities between what you do and the intelligence world.
Yeah, and look, our relationships are built on the same thing that everyone builds relationships on at this level, and that's trust. It's the trust that the information is going to be used as agreed upon, that you're not going to leak sensitive documents or locations or people. And it takes time to build relationships. And it took time to build those relationships in Gaza. In Israel, it wasn't as difficult because it's accessible. You can go down the street and you can meet with members of the military. For Black Saturday, when I was writing the book, I met multiple times with Israel's defense minister, Yoav Gallant. And we talked in a really frank way, probably the most casual way that you could really imagine in terms of this level of an official during a war.
Yeah.
Going to his office, having a cup of coffee, and basically just going back and forth, me asking questions, him giving me answers, sometimes him telling me, hey, I know the answer, but I can't tell you the answer. It's classified. But the book has a lot of information from his perspective, which I find very interesting. The relationships that were the hardest to develop had to do with the ones inside Gaza. And I spent years developing them with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, but they're also the most sensitive relationships. And I talk about that a little bit in the book. There was a time back in 2019 where I got trapped in Gaza. I was there shooting a feature story on these demonstrations that were ongoing. Hamas invited me to go to a military parade with the Al-Qassam brigades, the guys who carried out the massacre on October 7th. And that was crazy access, standing in the backs of pickup trucks with these Nukba fighters who had been trained to conduct a massacre like they ultimately ended up conducting on October 7th, and talking to them about how they had devoted their life to jihad, to devoting their life to ultimately destroying Israel. But I always tell people it's a spectrum. The guys that you meet that are actually on the front lines of an attack or in battle are not the same guys that are calling the shots at the top of the political level. Some of those guys, the leadership of Hamas, they went to school in Europe. And then they came back to Gaza and they speak English and you can talk to them without a translator. They're very different than the guys that you meet on the ground who are part of the Al-Qassam brigades in the military wing. And those guys are very different than the average Palestinian civilian that you meet in Gaza, some of which are just trapped amid war, caught in the crossfire. And so it's a spectrum of people that you meet, but when it comes down to it, it's all about sourcing and it's all about trust. How can you develop that relationship with whoever you're talking to?
And can you explain for people the difference between Hamas and its militant wing and Islamic Jihad?
Yeah, absolutely. So the two largest factions inside Gaza, you've got Hamas, the group that is, or you could say was, in control of the Gaza Strip since 2006. And then you've got Islamic Jihad, the second largest faction. And these are the two major factions that have the rocket arsenal. And Hamas is the group that planned, coordinated, and mainly conducted the October 7th massacre. But the group itself has two wings. It acts as a political party, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, and then also as a military wing, the Al-Qassam brigades. And within the Al-Qassam brigades, you have Nukba fighters who are considered the special forces of Hamas. And they led the charge on some of the Israeli military bases along the border when the massacre was unfolding. They were followed by more, you could say, average soldiers of Hamas, average militants who have training but aren't considered special forces. And then those fighters were followed by civilians who came into Israel on October 7th. Now, Islamic Jihad also participated in the massacre, and they also fired rockets during the war. But the main group in charge, calling the shots, was Hamas, an organization that was led by three individuals, Mohammed Def, Yahya Sinwar, and Ismail Haniyeh. Mohammed Def was killed in an Israeli airstrike earlier this year. And as we know, back in July, Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of the political wing of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, was killed in an explosion in Tehran, the Iranian capital, just a few weeks ago from when we're having this conversation. And so the only man left in terms of the masterminds behind the October 7th massacre is Yahya Sinwar, who is believed to be in the tunnels beneath Gaza, surrounded by Israeli hostages.
Man, I'm going to ask you about those tunnels here in a moment. But another great thing about the book, and even in the PDF version that I just read, the maps in the beginning. I love having maps in books, and adds a little context before you jump into the narrative, the facts. And these are great because there's multiple maps that take you right there. It really explains where everything is, the West Bank, Gaza, where Hezbollah is located, primarily in the north. You get a very good sense of what who the players are in the region just visually by looking at those maps. So in Black Saturday, I love that you put those in there. And I want to go back to October 7th, morning of. How do you wake up on that morning?
Wanted to tell you one note about the maps. You'll notice on these maps, they're not political. There are a lot of areas of the Middle East, especially around Israel, that are fought over. They're contested areas. The Golan Heights, for example, you'll notice the map, it has a checkered map for the Golan Heights because it used to be a part of Syria. It's not recognized by the entire international community as part of Israel. And so even what you'll hear from Israeli officials or what you'll hear from Palestinian officials and Hamas officials, they describe these maps as different things. And so it is the most objective map that you could find, that you could write. And it was made specifically for Black Saturday as to not be controversial. Also on the map, you'll notice that the city of Jerusalem sits right on the line between Israel and the West Bank, because again, it's contested territory between East and West Jerusalem. So it's just a note there about those maps at the beginning of Black Saturday.
Yeah, they're fantastic. Morning of, you wake up and I don't know why it surprised me. It shouldn't surprise me, but you went right to X and to see what was happening. And I shouldn't be surprised because typically that's where I go as well if something hasn't hit kind of more mainstream news services, hasn't been fully vetted yet, just to get a sense of something happened. It's getting harder to do, by the way, on X with people just putting stuff up there that I need to figure out a way to filter that confusing stuff out that's just made up. But I shouldn't be surprised that you went right there, but that's what you did. So how do you wake up that morning?
Yeah, I get a call at 7:03 a.m. on the morning of October 7th from my producer, basically telling me that something's going on in the South. She doesn't have a lot of details, but we know there are rocket sirens sounding across the country and something's going on. And so my initial thought is that the Israelis have taken out a Hamas or Islamic Jihad commander, as they've done in the past, which ultimately leads to 3 or 4 days of rocket fire, Israeli airstrikes, and then some sort of limited ceasefire agreement. And so this is what I figure is going on. I go straight to X because X is the place where people are getting news now. It's the place to get real-time updates on what's happening here and around the world. And I use it every single day because it's where a lot of journalists are talking about what's happening. And also, as you noted, you have to be a critical consumer of X content because it's not all accurate and people can post whatever they want. But I find that the algorithm ends up getting me some of the people that I know and trust and follow. And so I see some videos and some maps that show there is indeed rocket fire all over southern and central Israel. And so my immediate thought is, all right, we need to get to the south and start reporting. We've been through this before. We've done this drill before. We go to the city of Sderot, a city of about 30,000 people that sits just on the Gaza border, and we start our coverage. And generally, we have reported from Sderot because there are a bunch of bomb shelters in the city. It's also quite close to the Gaza border, so it takes a lot of mortar fire too. And as a frontline war zone correspondent, you want to be where the action is. And so that's traditionally where it has been. And we've reported from there. And so that morning, get up, I call my boss and I tell him we're headed to the south. We're going to Sderot, the parking lot we always report from, and we'll go from there. Call the team once I get the green light, send a message to the group, and ultimately we make a plan. We're going to meet in Sderot and we'll figure out what's going on. I go out to my balcony though, after I hear some sirens sounding in Tel Aviv, Israel's second largest city, And this is really the first indication that this is a very serious attack, because they're firing on Tel Aviv, which is largely off limits for Hamas and Islamic Jihad unless they want to draw Israel into a broader conflict. And so immediately I see rockets slamming into the sea and being intercepted overhead by Israel's missile defense system. And again, this is a sign that something is very, very wrong, but it's not a sign that there is a widespread infiltration in the south. And so I start reporting on my phone. It's the only device I have. I had a light bulletproof vest on my mantle, and you'll know this, but it's important to explain to the audience. A light bulletproof vest isn't going to do much for shrapnel from a rocket, and it's certainly not going to do much for direct impact. But I put it on because it's better than nothing, and it's also a signal to my bosses that I'm doing everything I can in this moment to stay as safe as I can while still getting the story. So I go out, start reporting, and these interceptions are happening. Okay, we need to get to the south. Clearly something's going on. I'm coordinating with my producer and the cameraman. We're going to meet in Sderot or somewhere along the way, but let's just get down there. I get in my Jeep Wrangler and I start driving south, and there are rockets being intercepted overhead. But it's Saturday morning, and so this is the day of rest for the Jewish people, the Sabbath. And so no one's on the street, there's no traffic, and anyone who was on the street, maybe walking to synagogue, they've now gone to a bomb shelter because there are rockets being fired at the city. And so I'm not going to pull over and shelter every time there was a rocket. I'm running red lights. I'm just trying to get to the south as quickly as I can because I want to start reporting. But as I'm driving down Route 4 to head to the south, the rocket fire is really heavy, and I can see these rockets slipping past Israel's missile defense system, the Iron Dome, and slamming into the ground on either side of me. And at one point, I decide I'm going to pull over because it's just too heavy, the fire. And I ultimately basically take cover next to the car where some civilians have pulled off to the side of the road. And I'm still reporting, though. You know, I never stop reporting on the way down. I'm taking still photos on my camera. I'm using my phone to do updates for social media, get some video. And there's a rocket intercepted directly overhead. And I thought for sure we were going to get hit by shrapnel because it was so close. You could feel the impact of this interceptor round directly impacting the rocket right overhead. Get back in the car. I see some smoke in the distance. I call my producer and I ask her if she can see the smoke that I'm seeing. It's this huge plume where clearly a rocket had hit a building. And she says she can. I see some fire trucks and I start following them to the scene, and we're going to meet there and start reporting. And I get there, and I can't find my team. I'm calling them. I'm getting a little bit antsy because we want to get the story. And ultimately, they show up. We do some pieces to camera so that I can report later. And then we head back to the south. And this is the moment where things get really, really intense. And I write about this in Black Saturday.
You do. Actually, I want to ask you a little more about that as we go on here. But who is, can you explain for people the team? Who's part of this team that you pull together when something happens, and the difference between a producer and then a fixer in Gaza whose name Nael?
Niall. Yep.
Like the differences between the team members that allow you to go out and do what you're doing.
Yeah, so I've got a team that works with me on the ground in the Middle East, and it consists of a producer whose job is to do everything from coordinating live shots to maintaining sources to gathering information to making sure we have the right elements in place when we're doing a live report. But on a morning like this, it's a lot of coordination. And so my producer is gathering information, what little information we had at the time, and we're basically going back and forth with each other to determine what the best course of action is, where to go and where to start reporting, and then coordinating with our office in New York to get these live shots out to our audience on Fox News. And then I've got a cameraman who shoots video, does the live shots for me, and a technician to make sure the shot is up. Later in the war, we have a security team member who is a guy who served in the Australian Army and is a real operator and works to keep us safe in real time as we're going on these embeds into Gaza and reporting from southern Israel as the war unfolds. But I keep a pretty tight team. There are some correspondents that want a larger team, multiple producers with them, a larger crew, but I find that the fewer people you have, the more nimble you can be and flexible in these situations. And so on this morning, the plan is to meet my producer, my cameraman, and then ultimately my technician in southern Israel so that we can start shooting video of the scene and then get live shots out to our audience on Fox News.
Yeah. And it's obvious from reading the book that you're not just going on, and of course, that morning they didn't exist, but do you call them a press tour? Is that what they're called when you have a group that goes around and sees what whoever's in charge wants you to see? You do the opposite of that, it seems. It seems like that's just a part of who you are and what you do. But it's very obvious that that's not something that you're primarily interested in unless you have to do it. But going out there and getting the real stories and doing it on your own, not just taking a guided tour, which is, it's obvious from when you see you on Fox News, but then to hear you talk about it and talk about what these other kind of press briefings and tours and that sort of thing, what those are, it was really interesting to me. Can you talk about Chen? Is that how you say it? Chen?
Ken. Yeah, Ken.
Yeah. About that experience, that story.
Yeah. In Black Saturday, we write, after my team met, a woman named Chen Almog Goldstein, and she is a survivor. I think that's the way that we should refer to her, because she truly survived something that a lot of people would not have. And her story it's horrific. She is one of the hostages taken into Gaza on October 7th. And she is someone who I meet later in the war after she's released as part of the November ceasefire deal. But she loses members of her family on that morning. Hamas storms into these communities along the border because, as we would come to find out on October 7th, this wasn't just a rocket attack. This was an infiltration into southern Israel, into dozens of communities along the border where civilians were in their homes. They were sleeping or they were resting on that Saturday morning. And in a community called Kfar Aza, one of the hardest hit neighborhoods and towns along the border, she's at home with her family when they're hiding in their mamad, their bomb shelter, and Hamas militants storm the house, and she witnesses the murder of her family members. And without getting too much into the details of what takes place, she is taken into Gaza as a hostage. And she is, again, I think the only way to describe her is a survivor, because what she witnesses and what she hears and what she sees inside Gaza is so horrific that as you're reading it, you'll see, and you may have experienced this, you think to yourself, how does anyone get out of this alive? How do they mentally make it through Hamas captivity? But she is released as part of this November ceasefire deal, and ultimately I interview her in the process of our reporting on this story. And I think she is a representative example of the more than 200 people who were taken hostage into Gaza on October 7th.
Yeah, what's remarkable about Black Saturday, your book, is that it's not just your perspective of you getting to these sites and reporting. It's that, and it's these experiences of other people, and juxtaposing what you're doing, what had happened to them, what happens to them over the course of the time that you write about, which is almost a year, not quite a year, in the book. And it's just remarkable. And it's so, it's horrifying on one side, it's inspiring on another, and just the human toll that you managed to bring into all of it is remarkable. And I really hope everyone gets this book, adds it to their library, gifts it to people, because it will really add context to what's going on in the Middle East and humanize what's happening there as well. So I think it's a work that it's a very important one, especially to come out here on the year anniversary of the event. 11 miles inside Israel. The incursion 11 miles into Israel. And you talk about how Hamas planned this out, hitting these communication lines, using drones to hit those communication lines. We stay fixated on those the gliders that came in and hit the music festival and those things. But there was a lot of other parts to this that allowed them to really strategically hit these different kibbutzes. One that was really very remote, 400 people, 25% of that kibbutz, as you explain in the book, is impacted. Like 20 deaths, 80 taken hostage into Gaza. But as you're doing this reporting, what is the tone is then now over the last year as far as being able to defend these kibbutzes and being able to own firearms and having civil defense forces waiting on the military, waiting on specialized units. Has there been lessons learned from October 7th that have now been incorporated that maybe will allow these communities to better defend themselves?
Yeah, definitely. And this border fence and underground barrier was touted to us when we reported it in southern Israel years prior as one of the most advanced in the world, basically impenetrable. But ultimately, Hamas was able to systematically destroy the Israeli defenses that were there. And it caught, of course, the civilians off guard, but it caught the army off guard. And I think this is an underreported part of the story about the military bases that sit along the Gaza border. They were overrun by Hamas, and you had soldiers, often very young soldiers, 18 to 20 years old, who were there as part of their required duty as Israeli citizens on a weekend, on a holiday, and they were sleeping at the time. And so you can imagine well-trained militants storming a base like this in what is the worst case scenario for Israel. This was largely seen as something that could never happen. It not only a worst case scenario, an impossible scenario. And so the bases along the border very quickly were overwhelmed. And you had some hostages taken, and you had firefights that erupted. But again, these militants just simply were able to come with so much firepower and extra ammunition and RPGs and IEDs that they were able to put on walls and blow through doors. And they went so deep into Israel that the army was immediately overwhelmed. And so hours and hours went by that these kibbutzim, these communities along the border, had no soldiers in them. They had no police officers. Many of them had a local response force that was able to put up a fight and actually defend and protect some of them. But there were a lot of lessons learned because the border fence and the security along the border was not able to stop this initial assault. It took hours and actually days for the Israelis to clear southern Israel. And so that was probably the biggest lesson learned, is that they have to have forces along the border with Gaza. And they have to have soldiers who are acting on intelligence when they gather it in real time, because there were major intelligence failures. That's one of many objective criticisms that people have of the Israeli military amid this war. And there are many, and we can and we should get to those on the war inside Gaza. But there were clear intelligence failures. And from what we saw in our reporting, Jack, there were so many dead militants all throughout southern Israel that I really in real time couldn't wrap my mind around just how large this attack was. There were roads that we were driving down and you just saw dead Hamas fighter after dead Hamas fighter in cars on the sides of the road next to bomb shelters. And it really gave you a sense of just how widespread this attack was. They sent everyone they could at Israel, overwhelming these border posts, overwhelming these bases. And so there are major lessons learned, not just from a security standpoint on the border, but also, arguably more importantly, from an intelligence standpoint for the Israeli military and Shabak.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that here in a moment. When did you realize the scope of what was happening?
I remember exactly when I realized the scope of what was happening. It was at this intersection that we stopped at, and I realized that the people that were being dragged out of these cars and thrown into this triage point where they were then transported to hospitals or to body bags, they were wounded with bullets. They weren't wounded by shrapnel. And that was an indication that the gunfire we heard in the distance wasn't just the Israelis firing toward Hamas, it was Hamas firing toward the Israelis. And that was a moment, I think, for me, a personal and professional turning point in this story on that morning on October 7th, when the team and I realized these people had been wounded by gunfire and the militants are still here. They're still in Israel. And that changed the feel of that morning, because we realized we were not reporting on a massacre that took place. We were reporting on a massacre that was unfolding before our eyes.
Wow. And private firearm ownership in Israel. So growing up, I was reading everything I could possibly read on warfare around, I mean, anytime a Time or a Newsweek, the newspaper, anything had something about the Middle East. I remember the Falklands War. Of course, I remember Desert One and 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, Panama, Grenada, like all those things as a young kid, those captivated me. Time Life books, our Britannica and World Book encyclopedias. And I'd go to those photos, and I remember these photos of Israel, black and white from the 40s, 50s, 60s, that would show these kibbutzes and these women, men too, but holding World War II, sometimes even pre-World War II, bolt-action rifles and defending the kibbutz, defending Israel. And so that was in my mind from when I was very young all the way up, really, to October 7th. And I always thought that Israel's experienced, well, even before Israel, just so much hatred, and you're surrounded by enemies that everybody there must be armed. And then I came to find out that's not necessarily true. What is private firearms ownership like in Israel?
Yeah, it's a great topic to discuss because it's a misconception about Israel that everyone is armed. What's interesting here is you'll see it in the news, and when you walk down the streets in Tel Aviv, there are a lot of civilians or people that look like civilians that have firearms. And they have them because they're in reserve duty for the army. And since October 7th, it's become easier to have a handgun, for example, but it's not very simple, because you have to have proved that you served in the army, and they've reduced some of the restrictions on private firearm ownership since October 7th to make it more accessible so that people are able to fend off attacks, especially terror attacks that happen here quite frequently on a weekly basis in some capacity. But before October 7th, it was difficult, and people can't just, as a private citizen, go and apply for a license to own a firearm. And so now it's gotten easier, but before, the people that had guns had to prove that they needed a gun. And so some of these communities, they had these local forces of guys and women who basically signed up to defend their communities in case of an infiltration attempt like this. But I talked with a lot of them, and they didn't ever train for what happened on October 7th. Infiltrations weren't something that were totally unheard of. There were infiltrations in the past, but they consisted of maybe one militant or maybe a small cell of militants trying to kidnap someone or commit a terror attack, not a widespread attack of 3,000 gunmen crossing the border and committing a massacre in real time. And so they had trained for this. There were people who had weapons, and there are actually stories, and I touch on some of them in the book, but some of them we just didn't have time in the course of our reporting for TV, and I didn't have time in the course of writing this book to include. But I remember I met this one guy from a kibbutz in southern Israel, very close to the Gaza border. And I was asking him, there weren't casualties in your kibbutz. Why was that? And he said, because we trained and I knew the guys, and we immediately coordinated. This is what he told me. We coordinated right away. We got on our phones, noticed we didn't have cell signal. He went over to his neighbor's house, and I remember him telling me this story, and this isn't included in the book, but it's an interesting story. And he goes to a shoebox in his closet, and he pulls out all this loose ammunition and starts loading magazines, starts handing out the magazines to his neighbor. They take positions outside their house, and when Hamas approaches, they start firing. They're in a firefight, and they kill a bunch of these militants. And they were able to push back, repel this attack from their community. And some communities had the ability to do this and others didn't. There's also a person in the book that you'll notice is I think really the standout operator from this book, this man named Guy. And I meet him later on. We'll get to that. And actually, you've got to read Black Saturday to know where I meet him. But he responds on the morning of October 7th in Sderot. And I recently went back to interview him as part of a longer series that we're doing about the war. And he tells me in Israel, you're only allowed to have 3 magazines, even if you have the license to carry. And he says to me, sort of whispers to the camera, I had 7. I had them in my closet. And you just think, okay, this guy's an operator. You know, he's bending the rules a little bit. He's actually a firearms instructor.
Nice. Maybe he meant 3 on him at any given time, and you can have some like right here. Yeah. Oh man. You and your dad texting throughout this also got me for whatever reason. One of those things that isn't humanizing the situation, but humanizing you, the person that's in front of that camera, that's so stoic and informed and calm all throughout the day on Fox. But the texting that you added in there, I thought really added to the story to humanize you, and that was very emotional to read. But going back to the strategic lessons of what happened, another one of those misconceptions, kind of like the firearm ownership thing for me, was that Israel is there's a mystique, or there was a mystique at least, to Israeli military and the intelligence services. And from the outside looking in, even as someone who's studied these things, I thought, wow, Israel, for its location in the world, regionally, it has got to be the best that there is, because they're regionally focused. Unlike the United States, flying to Iraq, flying to Afghanistan, not regional, for those listening or watching. But Israel, regional. Your enemy is right there, next door to you, essentially. Maybe a couple of countries away, if you look at it a little more broadly, obviously. But the general consensus, and I don't think I'm the only one who assumes this, but the assumption is based on past operations, past history, and probably some TV shows and movies and books that talk about Israel with this kind of this aura and this mystique of invincibility. And really, that was shattered on October 7th of last year.
Yeah.
What are the broader consequences of that, of people around the world, but more importantly for Israel, neighbors essentially, or people in the region realizing, oh, this isn't as impenetrable and invincible as maybe we thought, because of some of Israel's maybe more pinpoint strikes, sometimes also through proxies in Iran with nuclear scientists and that sort of a thing. But they've been very successful, Israel, at keeping the enemy off balance, and also I think off balance in a way, not just physically, but also like, oh, Israel might have someone within my circle. I just don't know. And I think that, I mean, obviously that was disproven, not that instance specifically, but more broadly, that this intelligence services and this military organization is not invincible. And so what are the broader consequences of that strategically?
It's a great question. And I think that the Israelis learned, and they knew this in many ways, but I think the world also learned, the best battle to fight, if you've got to fight a battle, is to not go to war at all. And that's really what Israel is now faced with on a broader conflict. We're going to sort of start in present day and go back to October 7th. And that's really what Israeli officials have to look at now, and really people across the region, including Iran and its proxies like Hezbollah, is, do you really want to go to a broader conflict? On October 7th, the conflict came to Israel. And there's been an ongoing, you could call it a war of attrition between Israelis and Palestinians for decades. But what we saw on October 7th was a lesson to many. And I think it's even a lesson to me. As I wrote Black Saturday, and as I reported on the ground in southern Israel on the morning of October 7th and throughout the war, the past 300 plus days, you learn that what you think about an army is not always true. And even as someone who has reported on the ground in the Middle East, you learn in real time how people actually operate and how militaries operate. There was this misconception that the entire world, and even myself, had. This idea that everyone in the military here is this advanced operator. And I've done embeds with elite units in the IDF. And those guys are advanced operators. They're the people that do the missions. They're the ones that go on the raids at night. And they're quite successful at doing it. And they do raids on a daily basis here, especially in the West Bank, in cities like Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarem. But on the morning of October 7th, those elite units weren't in the field. They weren't on assignment. They weren't the ones dispatched immediately to fight Hamas. It was anyone who had a weapon. It was a civilian who was at home with his wife and kids. It was a police officer. It was soldiers on base or reserve soldiers who were at home at the time. I write about a friend of mine, Itai, who is in Miluim, reserve duty for Israel. And I think he's a good representative example of the people who had to respond that morning. He's a great guy. He works in high tech and in real estate, and oftentimes we meet for coffee. He plays tennis, but he's not in the special forces of the Israeli military. But on the morning of October 7th, I run into him. He's driving a Jeep into battle against Hamas, and then ultimately serves as Israel fights the war inside Gaza. And he's just a guy now. I mean, he served in the army. He did his duty, but he's not been training every single day to fire a weapon. But ultimately, he had to use his weapon on the morning of October 7th and throughout the war. And so many, thousands of soldiers, thousands of people who responded on that day were just people, many of them just civilians who did the best they could to defend their country with what they had. And I can tell you, because we witnessed it firsthand, what they had was not a lot. They didn't have stockpiles of ammunition. There were soldiers that we saw, people, police officers, literally taking individual bullets out of their pockets and loading them into magazines, not having full clips, and just running toward the battle because they had to do whatever they could to stop Hamas on that morning.
Yeah. And the intelligence failure in the lead up, obviously you mentioned decades of tensions, obviously, but really from January of 2023 up to October 7th, there were some other things, tensions between Israel and organizations within Gaza, and also within Israel itself with the judicial reforms and things like that. What were those tensions like between January, being there on the ground and being in tune with what's going on, between January, let's say, of 2023 up until October 7th?
Yeah, there was a ton of political turmoil here. Weekly demonstrations against the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. He fired his defense minister and then rehired him because there was so much unrest in the streets of cities like Tel Aviv that he was worried about staying in power. The Prime Minister is also going through a major corruption case right now. And then you had the ongoing tension that exists in the region traditionally. The clashes taking place at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, the third holiest site in Islam, that Jews refer to this area as the Temple Mount. It's a contested area of Jerusalem and has been a hotbed of activity traditionally, a flashpoint for regional conflict in the past. And then you have just the ongoing rocket fire that takes place from Gaza. Whenever something goes wrong in the region, traditionally Hamas has used rocket fire as a way to ratchet up the tension, as a way to, I always describe a stove. They can turn up the heat on the stove and then turn it back down when they get what they want. And then, of course, the regional activity of Iran and its proxies that still threaten Israel. And so it's never calm here. And it wasn't calm before the October 7th massacre, but there was a status quo to what was happening. There was a tension, but a lot of the world focus wasn't here. It was on places like Ukraine, on places like China and concerns that China could invade Taiwan. And there were these other stories. But when October 7th happened, the world's attention shifted to the Middle East in a way that it hadn't really since Iraq and Afghanistan. And the news cycle picked up in a way that it hadn't for decades, I think. And it was something that I think the entire world really was captivated in a negative way by, because they saw, again, the horrific nature of war. They saw the October 7th massacre take place and the slaughter of so many Israeli soldiers and civilians. And then the days that followed and the weeks and months that followed, the killing of Palestinians inside Gaza, something that we also try to highlight in our reporting that's critical to talk about. People always want war to be black and white. They want things to be good and bad. And as you know firsthand, war's complicated. It's gray. And part of our job on the ground is to talk to everyone and sort of parse through the complexities of it and then bring those stories to our audience.
Yeah, one thing I really respect about you is how you do that. And you got advice from a correspondent, and this stuck with me as well. Be calm amid the storm. When did you get that advice? Because it's great not just for someone going into battle, either with a firearm or as a war correspondent, but in life in general and leadership in general. Be calm amid the storm.
There were many times in the early days when I first got here I had been a war correspondent in college. I was 20 years old, but being a war correspondent when you own your own company and you're a university student consists of taking a backpack, a DSLR, and when I was smart, a flak jacket and helmet, and then just heading toward the fire. Now, there are some things that I think about just in terms of what the situation on the ground looks like. But I got this advice from an old Fox correspondent who said, be the calm amid the storm. Because there were times where when I was first doing this at the network level, I was letting that adrenaline get to me. I was letting the emotions get to me. I was really loud. I was sometimes yelling into the camera because it was chaotic around me and I was matching that energy. And then I started to learn that you need to truly be the calm amid the storm. You need to control your breath. You need to have emotional clarity in what you do. And it's not to say you shouldn't process the shit that we're seeing. It's to say that you should process it at the right time. And I think when I first got into this work, sometimes I was trying to process it in real time. Something crazy would happen and I would try to keep reporting, but also work through what we were seeing. And that was sort of bleeding into the reporting. And I think now I separate it a lot more. And I think it's why you see more clarity in the reporting that I do now, because it's about getting the information in real time to the audience. And then later on, taking time to sort of work through what we saw. And if you need to work through that in a professional way to gather more information or context to a story, you do that. And if you need to work through it in a personal way, you do that too. And I encourage my team to do that. We talk about this stuff a lot because it's something you experience together. And it can be hard. It can be complex. Yeah. These are not easy things to see or to experience, but it's our work. It's what we do. And so to be the calm amid the storm is to have that clarity, to have that focus. Focus is the word that I love. It's the word that I use over and over. And to be able to put those, what I personally see as weaknesses, to the side and deal with them later.
Another thing you write here about in the book, you write, like war correspondents before me, I knew I was built for this moment. Like you knew you were exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. And I remember thinking the same thing in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. So that really stood out for me in Black Saturday as well. Along with this, you write, remember what you're talking about. They are human beings. That's somebody's father, somebody's brother, a friend or a coworker. So remember to keep that in mind as you, and I really appreciated how you thought through what it would be like for someone to view what you're reporting on or something in the background as a parent, as a brother, as a sister, as a grandparent that's watching you and seeing a relative, learning for the first time that they were either wounded or dead because of something that you're putting on the air in real time.
Yeah, and look, you'll probably be able to relate to this as well, and it's something I tweeted out recently. The best soldiers I've met around the world, the real operators, they're not happy about death. Even when they kill the enemy, even when they kill the guy shooting at them, they're not celebrating the fact that they get to kill. Generally, when you meet people like that, whether they're participating in a war or observing a war, they're not really the type of people you want to be around. And I think the same goes for us as journalists. Like, I wish none of this happened. I don't want to be here covering this disaster, but if I am, I need to cover it with moral clarity. I need to cover it with empathy for everyone involved. And I think that people get that wrong sometimes. They think there's only good guys and only bad guys. And the reality is that everyone, Israelis and Palestinians, exists on a spectrum. And the goal of the book of Black Saturday is to provide the information about what happened, but also to help you get into the minds of the people who are involved, the decision makers, both Israeli leadership and Hamas leadership, but also the civilians, the people who experienced the massacre on October 7th, and the people who are still, as we speak, experiencing the war. And that's why I talk with Israeli civilians. I talk with Palestinian civilians. I talk with the humans involved and try to understand what it's like for them. And it's not easy to read these things, but it's interesting. You get to understand what it's like to be a human amid war. And it's not a pretty thing, but it's a real thing. And that's why I tell people, A lot of times people will ask, well, am I going to like your book? Am I going to want to read it? I'm going to say, if you're a free thinker, if you're someone who wants to understand the truth and the complexities of war, specifically this war that erupted on October 7th and has continued for nearly a year, then yeah, you'll want to read Black Saturday, because we talk to everyone, Israelis, Palestinians. I pull no punches, no real criticism of anyone. I pull none of that, because it's war, and war is complex, and the people who are learning about war, the people who are reading about war, who are watching our reports, deserve the truth. And as a journalist, it's my job to demand accountability from everyone involved. And it's part of the reason I've been able to source up so well in the region. Because when I met Hamas leadership for the first time, I told them the very same thing that I told the Taliban when we went to Afghanistan. I told them the same thing. If you want to sign a peace deal, we'll report that. If you want to kill civilians, we're going to report that too. And the same goes for the Israeli military. If you're trying to rescue your hostages, trying to secure your border, we're going to report that. If 100 civilians are killed in an airstrike, we're going to report that too. And we're going to ask you questions about why you decided to make that call. Because I'm not here to make anyone look good or look bad. I'm here to tell people the truth about conflict. And that's what we do in our reports every day on Fox News. And it's what I do in Black Saturday as I cover this story.
Yeah, and it's such an important and necessary read. Everybody should pick up Black Saturday and read this book. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of Hamas calling this operation, naming it after the third holiest site in all of Islam, Alaska?
Yeah, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site in Islam. It's a traditional flashpoint for the region, and it is the goal for Hamas as an organization to be able to retake in their mind Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is a city that has been contested for thousands of years. When you go to Jerusalem, you can see cities that were built on top of cities, that were built on top of cities. And it's quite fascinating as an objective observer, as someone who's interested in history and interested in warfare. But the Al-Aqsa flood, as it was called by Hamas, it was called that for a reason. And the hope in the early days of the conflict during the massacre from Hamas leadership was that other countries and other enemies of the state of Israel would get involved, and that it would spark a larger regional war. And it did that to some small capacity. You know, Israel since October 7th has been attacked truly on 7 fronts, right? It's not just Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza. We were here on the ground earlier this year as a Houthi drone from Yemen slammed into the center part of this city, killing 1 person. We were here on the ground when Iran launched an attack in April with cruise and ballistic missiles. We've been in the north reporting on the front line there amid attacks from Hezbollah, Iran's largest proxy in the region. We've seen the attacks from Iran-backed Iraqi and Syrian Shia militias. And so in some capacity, they are facing a regional war. It's not as large as it could be, but that's part of what American diplomats, as we speak, are trying to avoid. It's why they're trying to bring all these parties to the table. It's why this shuttle diplomacy is going on behind the scenes, because they want to avoid a larger regional war. And that's part of the reason, to go back to what we talked about earlier, in terms of the Israeli response to October 7th, it's part of the reason the Israelis, over the weekend, as we're recording this, launched preemptive strikes against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon for one reason only: deterrence. They want their enemies to be afraid. They want them to know about the Israeli Air Force and the ability of the planes that fly over this city that we've heard often over the past 48 hours to strike deep inside Lebanon, to strike even as far as Iran. And so this is sort of the long answer to a short question, which is Hamas named their operation the Al-Aqsa Flood because they wanted to send a message to the region that they could take Jerusalem. Israel is responding not only in Gaza, but across the region, because they want to send a message that they'll never allow that to happen. And it's part of the impasse. It's part of the reason that I write toward the end of the book that my personal take on this, in a very pessimistic way, is there is no peace here, and there won't be any peace. Because I think it's a utopia view of the world that doesn't exist. And it's sad, because I wish there would be peace. I hate watching the death and destruction, not just here on the ground, but around the world, because it it sucks as a person to see, but it also sucks to see as a journalist, because we're there gathering these stories from people who lose everything. They lose their loved ones, they lose their house. But I will tell you, Jack, it helps you to put things into perspective, because you realize it could always be worse.
Yeah, it can always be worse. And it seems like this is just war in general. Violence is part of the human condition, unfortunately. We're pretty good at it. Tell me about October 10th. It's something I had not read before, and perhaps I just missed it somewhere. But Israel was set to attack Hezbollah in the north. Jets in the air. An hour before the first bomb is about to drop, the mission's called off after Netanyahu speaks with President Biden. Netanyahu then overrules the cabinet. Strikes are called off. I hadn't seen that reported anywhere before. What else do you know about that?
Yeah, this is one of the most sensitive 24-hour periods of the war. And you'll notice in the book, the attribution for this information is very broad, because I spoke with a lot of people on the record, and I spoke with a lot of people on background and off the record for the book, so that Black Saturday could really give readers a true story of what took place and how complex it was. Some of the decisions that were made in real time and some of the decisions that weren't made in real time. But this 24-hour period, October 10th going into October 11th, the Israelis basically primed their Air Force to strike Hezbollah, to launch preemptive strikes like we saw over the weekend, but to take out largely the capabilities of this Iran-backed group in southern Lebanon so that they wouldn't be able to strike Israel and conduct what we have seen over the past nearly a year be basically a war of attrition between the two sides. Daily Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon and daily rocket fire coming from Hezbollah. And the jets were in the sky. They were prepared to launch a bombing campaign against Hezbollah. And there was some argument ahead of time. And at the very last minute, after a conversation between President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister called off the strikes. And that changed the course of the war.
And what do you think the reason for that was? One, just hearing that and reading what I read in the book, we're making the assumption that Biden called specifically to either pressure or talk Netanyahu out of conducting these strikes. What is that long-term strategy? What was the advantage for the U.S. or the U.S.'s vision of why that would benefit Israel not to conduct those strikes? And then why did Netanyahu go ahead and then either take that advice or succumb to that pressure or take that action?
So it likely came from the Americans. And when the Prime Minister came back into that meeting, it was clear that he had changed his mind. But the Americans provide Israel with financial and military support at a huge scale, billions of dollars every year. And they've ramped up that support since the war began to ensure that the Israelis have what they need to defend themselves against a broader attack and to go on the offensive in places like Gaza. And that's part of the reason that the Israeli campaign, in coordination with the Americans in terms of the supply of weapons, has been so consequential in Gaza, because the Israelis have killed thousands of civilians in their campaign against Hamas. And some people find that controversial. It's not controversial, it's true. They've also killed thousands of Hamas militants in the process. And analysts of this war and of the region will debate the ratio for the rest of time. But American weapons are being used in Gaza, but they're also being used in the rest of the region. And so on that night, going into the 11th, the Americans are always looking for diplomacy first. It's part of this administration's MO on foreign policy and conflict. It's how they approach these things. And you could make an argument that they want to avoid a broader war that they could be dragged into as a result. And so there was an encouragement not to do something that intelligence analysts were worried would spark a broader regional conflict that would ultimately drag in the United States. And so now some officials that you talk to here say, well, the U.S. is already dragged into a war because Israel didn't act. And in hindsight, it's interesting to look at, because you see the movement of forces. You see how so many American forces are now around the Middle East, not just in the Mediterranean Sea off in the distance here, but in the Red Sea, because they want to act as a deterrent force. But now it's not just about deterrence. It's not just that single word. It's also about if Israel has to go on offense because there is a broader war that erupts. And so the first role of the United States now in the region is to deter Iran and its proxies from attacking Israel. But if they do, and this goes to a larger war, you will see American ships firing missiles, helping the Israelis to shoot things down, possibly even to target Hezbollah. That's from what we understand now based on our reporting, talking to US and Israeli officials. But when we go back to that day, October 10th into the 11th, this was about deterrence. And then ultimately a decision was made and likely encouraged by President Biden not to spark a broader war as to not drag the United States in.
Yeah, interesting that, so when you look at populations, it's 50,000, it would be the equivalent of Israel losing 50,000, or the United States losing 50,000 citizens in an attack. And then if you look at this particular situation, it would be the equivalent of somebody from an allied nation calling President Bush 3 days after September 11th, 2001, and asking him not to do anything in Afghanistan, not to go after whoever was responsible for these attacks, at least right now, or at least to talk them out of an initial strike. It'd be, there are parallels there. So it's interesting to say, as you said.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of people drew the parallels because they see that, I mean, this relationship, it's critical for Israel, but it's also critical for the United States, right? They don't have the footprint in the Middle East, and there are a lot of intelligence sharing capabilities that go back and forth between the two countries. And that's why you've seen US drones even over Gaza to help the Israelis gather intelligence, but also over places like Yemen, where the Houthis have shot down $32 million American Reaper drones. But the US is still involved in it, as you know, but the audience may find interesting, right? If you look up a map of US bases around the world, it's staggering how many footprints there are of US personnel, because they want to maintain a presence. So Israel also provides a critical allied relationship to the United States. It is certainly a two-way street.
Yeah. And so I want to be very respectful of your time. I know how busy you are just by being a consumer of news and seeing you on TV. But you talk about it in Black Saturday, in your book Black Saturday. And then as I started reading it, I was gonna ask you about it anyway and see how you responded. But then you address it early on, and then more as you go on, and it's how this has affected you, not just this, but the other war reporting that you've done, the post-traumatic stress, how this has affected you personally. And I want to read one thing here. You write, "Meanwhile, I had started to struggle in silence with what we'd seen in the first few days. We're taught in journalism school how to report, not how to clean someone else's blood off the bottom of your boots, as I had to do again and again. The toll of the reporting, the mounting pressure of an expanding war were building, and moments jumped up on me without warning, indications, given my experience with PTSD, that once the adrenaline wore off, I might have to face some of the demons we walked among." I mean, for you to share that, I think doesn't just help other war correspondents, it helps anyone dealing with post-traumatic stress of any kind, and then how you talk about it frequently in the book. So how has that changed you? How has the last year really changed you, and what toll has it taken?
These are hard things to talk about, and I brought it up in the book, and I bring it up often in real life when I have opportunities to speak with people, because I think mental health is really important to talk about. And, you know, we all, especially the guys I know, want to be tough, you know, watch David Goggins or Joko, and you know, like, we want to be guys who go to the field, get the story, come back, not moved, move on to the next assignment. And in many ways, I am that guy, and I want to be that guy. You know, that feels like it aligns with my identity. But I noticed, and it didn't start now, but I noticed back when I was covering the war in Ukraine, that if there were a lot of air raid sirens for a day and a missile attack, and then there were times in the east where we'd go in with the Ukrainian army into villages they just liberated, you'd see all these dead soldiers around, rotting corpses, just things that you're not used to seeing in everyday life. And the biggest way that manifested for me was nightmares. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sweating, breathing heavy, and the dreams were always pretty similar. There would be Russian soldiers at my house in rural Pennsylvania, and they'd be in the woods, and there'd be a battle unfolding, and then they'd try to take over my house, and there'd be no weapons around. Or I'd have nightmares about a rocket hitting our location or all sorts of things. And that was Ukraine. But I found that those nightmares sort of stopped eventually. Like they were really intense right after I'd covered something, and then it would sort of dwindle and die off, and then occasionally it would happen, but not as much. When October 7th happened, we were there on the ground on the morning of October 7th, and I remember the first guy that died in front of us. This officer that had pretty long beard. His friends brought him to this triage station, and they were working on him. They hooked him up to a defibrillator, and they tried to revive him again, and they stopped. That was it. And I kept working. I took some images on my camera, took some video, but it was real in that moment. Like people are dying, and then it progresses. And, we see, there's one time, and we go into Be'eri, one of the communities that sit along the border, and as we're driving in the distance, we see what looks like a big mound of dirt. And as we get closer, it's bodies that are stacked up of dead militants. And we get inside the community, and we go to a part of the community, and there are so many bodies in bags that it's hard not to trip over them. And again, as a war correspondent, I try to always be mentally and physically prepared for battle. Prepare for war by training during peace, right? I love the idea of it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war.
Yes.
And I really think about that a lot because you have to be ready. And October 7th was the perfect example. I went to bed not knowing that I would spend the next year of my life covering a war. Yeah. And especially not the next 24 hours and really the next few weeks under fire and covering this firsthand. But to get back to what we're talking about, mental health here, you see all these things and then you're expected to just go be a normal person. And they teach you in journalism school how to stand in front of the camera with your microphone and talk about war reporting, talk about the information, the people that you talk to. They don't teach you how you get back at night into some rundown hotel by yourself. There's an eerie quiet. I don't know what it was in those first days of the war. I didn't listen to any music. But you just sit on the edge of the bed, exhausted. You just see all these dead people all around you. The people that are alive that you talk to are sharing the most horrific things that you could imagine. You're seeing images of just terror. And then you realize there's blood on the bottom of your boots and you only have one pair of boots, so you need to scrub your boots and the blood's mixing with water, trying not to get it on your hands. And it's because you're walking through a house that was covered in blood where a family had been executed. And then you have to be a normal person. For me, I had nightmares about it. And they were intense at the beginning. And a lot of times, we're under rocket fire. And so I remember very distinctly, we'd be in a town like Sderot reporting live on Fox, and suddenly there'd be incoming rocket and mortar fire. And it said, Seva Adom, Seva Adom, Seva Adom, red alert, red alert, red alert. You hit the deck, don't have time to get to shelter. Rockets are getting intercepted overhead. We're live, got to keep reporting. Sometimes mortar fire, you hear the whistle, just hoping one's not a little short. And then you go to sleep, you can still hear it. And that was hard. But I don't have time to process that. I need to work. I need to send updates. I'm leading foreign coverage for the biggest channel in the United States. So I don't have time to sift through all that then.
Yeah.
And so it's just one of those things that it hits you and you got to deal with it after. And I always tell people, I want to be the change in the industry. I don't want to turn to drugs and alcohol like a lot of correspondents in the generation before me. I stopped drinking a year and a half ago, not because I had a problem with it, but because I was more productive and I didn't feel like it was adding a lot to my life. But I could easily see if you were drinking, a lot of that stuff you don't want to have to think about. And so you could easily drink to escape it. And I just don't want to be that guy. I want to go to the gym. I want to go on runs. I want to do cold plunges and try to maintain a stable structure so that I can go and do this again because I'm not running from it. I want to do this. This is a service I feel to our audience and I'm the guy to do it.
Yeah. How often do you think about October 7th, everything that's happened since, but how often do you go back to that morning and getting those calls and checking X, getting in your car, heading south, and then the difference between 1 minute 45 seconds between the intersection where you stop and what happens at the next intersection, because if you make a different decision that day, we're probably not having this conversation.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. My producer and I talk about it every time we drive to the South. We were so close to being ambushed that day that it really was just a matter of luck. We had no idea. We didn't know Hamas had infiltrated at this level. The only small pieces of information was there was a video of a pickup truck and it was circulating around, and there was some video coming in, but the idea that there were 3,000 Hamas militants in southern Israel along with civilians all throughout the area, and that gunfire that we were hearing wasn't just the Israeli army, it was Hamas. I mean, it was just chance.
Yeah.
It was just chance that we didn't get ambushed. And I think about that a lot because I don't know what I would have done.
Yeah.
Really. Like, we all like to think in hindsight that we would have just, there's a guy shooting at us in front of us and we're in the car, that we would have just ducked our head and tried to run him over. I don't know that I would have done that, because a lot of them were dressed as Israeli soldiers and they had weapons that looked similar to what the Israelis carry. And if I wasn't sure, am I going to run over an Israeli soldier? And even if I was sure, if we were close, got a little bit of introduction in Arabic, would I have tried to reason with them, explain I'm a journalist? I don't know. And then if we were there, like, they would have just shot us. They would have shot us. Like, the most likely outcome is that they would have killed us. And the idea that you know it's coming and you're just waiting, I think about that. Because it's like, I mean, you've been in firefights. You know this firsthand, right? I think it's one thing to have a weapon, and the heroes from the U.S. Army that go into battle and they know what they sign up for and they're mentally prepared and they're trained for it. You know, they're operators. They know how to do it. To be in a firefight with no weapon and just a camera and to be a sitting duck there in an ambush, like, that terrifies me. And I think about that because, like, what would that have been like, knowing that you couldn't surrender, you couldn't get away, and you're just waiting. They're coming at you and one of these bullets is going to hit you and it's going to be lights out.
Yeah.
And I think about that.
Yeah. In our final few moments here, first I want everyone to go buy this book, Black Saturday, read it, gift it, think about it when you're watching the news. But in our final few moments here, you're very active on social media. You want to meet those audiences. I thought that was something that was very interesting, that you want to meet these audiences where they are. And so you're very active on social media. I want to encourage people to follow you on X and on Instagram like I do. I think you're on TikTok, probably Facebook as well. But seeing what you do there, I think that is extremely important. And you talk about this in the book a little bit, and what a toxic environment social media is in general. Yes. But you have to take it from both sides. A lot of times if someone's reporting on something or commenting on something, they've chosen a side. So let's say 40 to 48% of people are going to say some positive stuff. You have to report facts, report the news, and upset both quote unquote sides in this situation. So you take it from both sides. Do you take that as, hey, I'm doing my job right? Or do you internalize this back and forth, and does social media affect you like it does anyone that's human?
I love this question, Jack, because every day it's like, you do one story and everyone hates it. And I'll just give you a recent example. Like, we did this story on these kids that were evacuated from Gaza as part of this joint Israeli-Emirati effort. And people who are pro-Palestine said, this isn't true. Israel can't be evacuating kids. They're the ones killing kids. And again, I'm not taking a side in the report. The information is presented as it is, as reality. And then you have people who are pro-Israel saying, well, why are they allowing them out of Gaza? You're highlighting this. This isn't right. And they're not happy with the story. And that's just on the content of the story. Then you have other reports where it is an objective report about what took place. And in the same thread on X, people will say, I am working for the Israeli military and government, and they will say, I am a anti-Israel, pro-Hamas spokesman on the same report, because the way that they interpret the facts are different. One person sees an airstrike against a position as something good, One person sees it as something bad. If civilians and militants are killed in the same airstrike, it's my job as a journalist to tell you both of those things. And it's not my job to break down if 10 civilians were killed, then that is unacceptable. If 100 civilians were killed, my job as a journalist is to bring you the facts. And if it were up to me, no civilians would be killed in war. But as a war correspondent, I know that civilians are killed. And I think it's my job as a war correspondent to put pressure on the Israeli military and the Israeli government and question them about how many civilians are being killed. But I can tell you on social media, people don't want the facts. They don't want to watch the part in a report where I am critical of the Israeli military. They just want to watch the fact that I said there were both militants and civilians killed in the same strike. And it's just my job as a journalist to deliver the facts. And so often you'll get one story and people will only want to highlight one side of it. And so what I do to attempt to push back against that is to provide as much raw information as I can from a human first perspective. And again, stress the fact that if it were up to me, no civilians would die during war and there would be no war. But that's not the case. And so we present the reports as we do, as facts first. I talk with Hamas officials. I talk with Israeli officials. I speak with Palestinian civilians. I speak with Israeli civilians. I'm critical of Hamas for killing civilians. I'm critical of the Israelis for killing civilians. And some people will tell me, well, you're putting them on the same level. No, I'm telling you what happened. And that's all I can do.
It's so tough today because back in, let's say, 1985, 1995, if someone wanted to make a comment about your reporting, they'd have to maybe call a number at Fox News and get patched through to someone who might listen for half a second, or they'd have to write a letter and find the address to Fox and address it and mail it, and then wait for a response, I guess. Probably someone would open it, notice that, oh, this person is crazy, and toss it into the garbage. But now there's no investment in someone making any comment, whether they really believe it or if it's a troll. I mean, you've had death threats, all the hateful comments on both sides. So as I was reading the book, I thought, you know what? I hope what he takes from this is that if he's getting hate from everyone, that he's probably reporting facts and doing the job.
Absolutely. And if I could, and I always try to explain this to any audience that's listening, is to have some empathy. Even if you're listening or you're watching or you're reading, have some empathy. Yeah. Have some empathy for everyone involved. Try to understand the people involved. Try to understand the bad guys because they do what they do for a reason too. And I'm interested in that. I want to learn and understand, but I think that having empathy, especially empathy for civilians amid war, is critical. Because what is disheartening as a journalist and someone who uses X and is online and seeing these comments is there are so many people on both sides of this conflict who wish death upon the other, who wish death upon the innocents on the other side, who are not involved, non-combatants. And if they would just take a second and watch my reports and think about them, they'd realize, and this is what I try to do in all my reports, is to humanize the people involved, especially the people who are civilians who don't want to be involved. Because Israelis and Palestinians are very similar in many ways. They both like to go to the beach. They both like to eat shawarma. They both laugh. They both love. They both feel sadness and happiness. And so often people on social media and online, they want to demonize the other side and say, well, they all support what's being done. Every Israeli supports the airstrikes that are taking place in Gaza, killing civilians. Or every Palestinian supports the Hamas massacre on October 7th. And that's not true. It's a spectrum of people. And guess what? As a journalist, even if someone exists on that spectrum of one side or the other of supporting the group but not participating in the action, you can't kill them. And that's important to note too. And so, my approach to journalism will always stay the same. It will be humans first, objectivity, the real facts on the ground. And at the end of the day, and if you look deep into my social media, you'll find my photography page, and it's called Experience Humans. And the goal with that page is to take photos of people existing all over the world, of good guys, of bad guys, of athletes, of musicians, of fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, so that people can look at the image and say, wait, that kind of looks like my kid, or hey, I kind of looks like my friend, or wait, they also go to the beach, they also like good food. Because you know what? Having spent time in Israel and having gone to Shabbat dinners and having spent time in Gaza and having gone to iftars during Ramadan, I can tell you, we have a lot more in common than we do apart. We have a lot more in common than people think.
Yeah.
And it's just so often people miss that online.
Yeah. Oh, online's a dangerous place. Oh, I want to wrap things up here. I know you have to go, and broader context of this conflict and how this ends. And you're right. The Israelis don't want to occupy Gaza long term. The Egyptians don't want anything to do with control of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority is largely unpopular among the Palestinian people and doesn't solve the ideological issue Israel faces, having a neighbor, Hamas, that wants to kill you. As I'm writing this, and likely when you're reading it, that question remains open.
Still remains open today.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, because the people who pay the highest price are the civilians, the people who are struggling to stay alive, the people who are living in fear on both sides of the border. Israelis that don't want to move back to the south because their kids are traumatized. Palestinians who have nowhere to go because they've been evacuated under orders of the Israeli military so many times and then seen airstrikes in those areas of evacuation. And so to find no solution is to make the civilian population in Israel and in Gaza suffer more.
Yeah.
And I remember I was talking to one doctor in Gaza during the war, and he said to me, I don't understand, Trey, I don't understand. This is going to end in negotiation. This is going to end in an agreement anyway. Why don't we just come to one now? There's a point, because as we speak, there are negotiators meeting. And as we look forward, there's no solution for anyone, because even if they reach a ceasefire agreement, it's not going to change the mentality of the people. And actually, in many ways, for Israelis and for Palestinians, this event, the October 7th massacre and the war in Gaza, has radicalized people to differing extents, right? It has shifted them on the spectrum of hawkishness. And you see it in Israel. People who were previously moderate or even left have gone more right. They have become more hawkish on the spectrum of war because they see it as necessary for their survival and security. They saw what happened, what Hamas did to their population, massacring civilians in their homes. And in Gaza, you can imagine if you see your community killed in airstrikes. This is something people get wrong a lot. I know we're wrapping up, but I think people oftentimes they say, well, what about this or what about that? And the reality is that civilians don't see how people are killed so different. When you ask Palestinians, what about October 7th? They say, well, what about the airstrikes in Gaza City that killed these people? And when you ask Israelis, what about Gaza? They say, what about October 7th? The reality is it's all horrible. The death and destruction is horrible. And so there is no solution. And looking forward, I write about this. The war continues today as we speak. Even if there is a negotiated settlement to get the remaining hostages, and we should talk about the hostages, that's critical. It's a critical part of this story. There's still more than 100 hostages in Gaza who will be exchanged for Palestinian prisoners at some point. Even if they come out, officials here tell me the war will continue to try to destroy Hamas, which is not possible because Hamas will continue to operate, even if it's an insurgency, even if they're ambushing Israeli forces, and they will continue to operate not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. And so there's no solution on the table. Long term, I don't know what the solution is, but my conclusion, as sad as it is that there is no peace here. And there won't be, at least in the short term. Yeah.
Man, well, I want to thank you for taking time today. I want to thank you for writing this book, Black Saturday, out now, published by Fox News Books. And I hope that it's not your last book. I hope that you look at these other it was so good that I found myself thinking, oh, I hope that he writes one about his experience and the broader experience in Ukraine and other places that you've been around the world. So I really hope that in the future you do that, because it's such a valuable read. And I found it so illuminating and so well done. And like I said, very emotional. So hope everybody goes out and buys it. Black Saturday, available now. And, stay as safe as you can. And I really appreciate what you do out there for all of us.
Thank you, Jack, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Take care. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to watch another episode, or click here to watch a clip from the podcast.